Oakhaven Priory, autumn 1842. The carriage wheels had barely stopped crunching over the gravel drive when Thorne Ashworth, 7th Duke of Oakhaven, understood that his wedding night was already ruined. He had expected tears. He had braced himself all through the cold ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square, for a bride who would retreat to her chambers and weep over the family she'd been sold away from, the fortune she'd never see, the husband twice her senior in debt, if not in years. He had rehearsed a short, kind speech about separate rooms and separate lives. He had not rehearsed this. Kerensa Fairweather, no, Kerensa Ashworth now, though the name still sat strangely on her, was standing in his library with her wedding gloves discarded on a chair and 40 years of estate ledgers spread across his father's old mahogany desk like a general's battle maps. "Your Grace," she said, not looking up, "did you know your uncle has been charging you 4% above the agreed rate on the northern mortgages since 1839? Bourne stood in the doorway, still in his wedding coat, snow melting on his shoulders. "I beg your pardon, Lord Stirling. Your uncle." She turned a page, and the candlelight caught the sharp line of her jaw. "He drew up these mortgage papers himself, after your father died. I've checked them against the Bank of England's published rates for each of the last 3 years. He has been quietly robbing you. 1.5%, then 2, then 4. It adds up to nearly £11,000. He crossed the room slowly, the way a man approaches a horse he isn't sure is broken. "You have been in my house for 6 hours, 5 hours and 40 minutes. She finally looked up at him, and there was nothing bridal in her expression at all, only a cool, assessing patience, as though she were pricing him for sale. "I asked your steward for the estate books before the wedding breakfast was finished. He was reluctant, but I believe he understood I would find them eventually regardless. Thorne had married her for one reason only, because his uncle had arranged it, and refusing would have meant losing what remained of Oakhaven to the same uncle by spring. Kerensa Fairweather's father had been transported for forgery 6 years ago, and no family of standing would touch her, which made her cheap, which made her available, which made her, so his uncle had promised, no trouble at all, a quiet girl, grateful for the match, easily managed. Nobody had mentioned that she could read a mortgage deed the way other women read novels. "Why does this concern you?" he asked. "You might have spent this evening resting. Nobody would have thought less of you for it. Everybody already thinks less of me, Your Grace." "My father saw to that." She said it without self-pity, the way one might report the weather. But nobody has ever called him a poor engraver. He was extraordinary at his trade. He simply used it on the wrong paper. She tapped the ledger. "I intend to use mine on the right one." Thorne poured himself a brandy he didn't particularly want, mostly to give his hands something to do. "And what trade is that?" "Paper, Your Grace. Look here." She unrolled a second document. Not a ledger this time, but a surveyor's map of the estate's northern valley, one he hadn't glanced at properly in years. "Your land has kaolin clay in the riverbeds and soft timber on the slopes above it. Together, worked correctly, they produce a paper fine enough and strange enough that no forger could easily copy it. The kind private banks pay a fortune to secure their notes. You want to turn my ancestral valley into a mill. I want to save your ancestral valley from your uncle, who currently owns enough of your debt to take the whole estate the moment you default, which, at his interest rates, you will do within 18 months. She said this as flatly as she'd said everything else, and it landed harder for it. "I am not asking you to love me, Your Grace. I am asking you to let me work." For a long moment, Thorn said nothing. Outside, the wind moved through the bare elms along the drive, and somewhere deep in the house, a clock struck the hour with a tired, uneven chime, as though even the Priory's timepieces had given up expecting good news. He thought of his father's slow decline these last years before his death, the fevered letters, the debts nobody could quite explain, the way the old man had aged a decade in 2 years. He thought of Sterling's oily condolences at the funeral. "Show me the figures again," Thorn said finally, and pulled out the chair beside her. Kerensa's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "I rather thought you might ask that." She slid the ledger toward him, and it was only then, as their fingers nearly touched over the columns of his uncle's careful, damning arithmetic, that Thorn noticed the second sheet tucked beneath it, a letter dated the week before their wedding, bearing his uncle's seal and Kerensa's father's forger's mark, side by side, as though the two men had once done business together. She had not shown him that one yet. The Valley Mills, winter 1843. By January, the Northern Valley had stopped looking like wilderness and started looking like a battlefield. Thorn stood on the frozen bank of the mill stream in his oldest coat, watching 24 local men haul timber frames into place around what had once been his grandfather's grain mill. The water wheel, seized with rust for a decade, groaned as the estate's carpenter forced it back into motion. Ice cracked and slid downstream in gray slabs. His breath came out in clouds, and his boots had long since stopped feeling like his own. Kerensa did not seem to notice the cold at all. She stood at a trestle table dragged out into the open yard, sleeves pinned back, stirring a shallow vat of gray slurry with a wooden paddle as though she were making soup rather than history. Rag fibers, clay, and river water, mixed in proportions she refused to write down anywhere, even for him. "You still won't tell me the ratios," Thorn said, coming to stand beside her. "I'll tell you the ratios the day I trust every man in this valley, the way I trust you," Kerensa said, not unkindly. Which is to say, not yet. He had learned, these 4 months, not to press her on this particular point. The formula had been her father's before it was hers, one of the few honest things the old forger had ever built. Ironically enough, a way of making paper nearly impossible to copy, developed in the same workshop where he'd later ruined himself faking Bank of England notes. Kerensa had watched him work as a girl. She remembered everything. What she hadn't inherited, or hadn't shown yet, was his willingness to cheat. "And the wire?" Thorn asked, nodding toward the small brass frame resting beside the vat. A mold woven with fine wire in a pattern he still couldn't quite make sense of, something like a rose crossed with a compass. "My father's design. I've only refined it." She lifted the mold and dipped it into the vat with the ease of long practice, drawing it up in one smooth motion, letting the water sheet off the fibers caught in the wire pattern. "When you hold this to the light, the watermark will be sharper than anything from a London paper house. No forger works quickly enough or carefully enough to fake it by hand. It would take them longer to copy 1 sheet than it takes us to make 1,000. Thorn watched the wet sheet catch the weak winter sun, the ghost of the pattern already visible even before it dried. It was, he had to admit, rather beautiful. He was still admiring it when the shout came from the gatehouse. "Bailiffs, Your Grace, coming up the mill road." Kerensa's hands did not stop moving. She laid the wet sheet carefully onto the felt beside her, exactly as though nothing at all had happened, and only then did she look up, her expression gone cool and flat, in a way Thorn now recognized as her preparing for battle. "Sterling," she said. "Sterling," Thorn agreed. 4 men came up the frozen track on horseback, led by a florid, self-important fellow in a good coat who introduced himself as a bailiff acting under a writ of seizure on behalf of a debt held by Lord Ignatius Stirling against the estate of Oakhaven. He produced a paper with a great flourish, as though he expected the sight of it alone to send men scattering. Thorn took the paper, read it once, and felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. "This writ concerns the eastern grazing lands," he said, "not the mill. Begging your grace's pardon, the debt is against the whole estate, and my instructions—" "Your instructions," Thorn said, in the voice he had only recently begun to trust himself to use, the one that made men remember, suddenly and inconveniently, that he was still a duke, "are worthless on this land, unless a court has specifically named this mill and its machinery, which this document does not do. I would advise you to read your own paperwork before you attempt to seize equipment on the strength of it." The bailiff's florid face went a shade paler. Behind him, one of his men shifted uncomfortably in the saddle. It took another quarter of an hour of argument, threats, and one increasingly nervous consultation among the bailiff's party before they finally turned their horses back down the frozen track, muttering that Lord Stirling would hear of this. Thorn watched them go, with his jaw tight enough to ache. When he turned back to the yard, Kerensa was already pressing the first properly dried sheet of their new paper flat between two boards, holding it up to check the watermark against the winter light. She did not look shaken in the least. If anything, there was something almost satisfied in the set of her shoulders. "You knew he'd try something like this," Thorn said. "I knew he'd try something," she said. "I didn't know it would be this clumsy. It's almost insulting." She held the sheet out to him. "Look, tell me honestly whether you've ever seen paper like it." He hadn't. The watermark sat inside the fibers, like something grown there rather than pressed in, catching the light in a way that seemed, faintly, to move. "He'll come again," Thorn said quietly. "With proper paperwork this time." "Yes," Kerensa agreed, already reaching for the mold to dip the next sheet. "Which is why we finish the first full batch tonight, Your Grace, and not tomorrow. The City of London, Spring 1843. The Merchant Bankers' Guild Hall smelled of beeswax candles, old wood, and the particular self-satisfaction of men who had never once had to prove themselves to anybody. Thorn had worn his best coat for the occasion, though he suspected it mattered little. A duke who arrived with mill-stained hands and a wife nobody would receive was still, in the eyes of this room, a duke playing at trade rather than a proper man of business. He could feel the glances as he and Kerensa were shown to their seats near the long oak table, not hostile exactly, but amused, the way a man might be amused watching a horse attempt to dance. Lord Stirling was already there, of course. He had positioned himself near the head of the table, deep in conversation with two aldermen, his silver-topped cane resting against his knee like a scepter. He caught Thorn's eye across the room and offered a small, courteous nod, the sort a man gives an opponent he considers already beaten. "He looks pleased with himself," Kerensa murmured, arranging her skirts as she sat. "He generally does. Not for much longer." The meeting proceeded through an hour of dull business, shipping insurance, a dispute over silver assay standards, before the chairman finally called for any new matters. Thorn rose. He felt Kerensa's hand brush his sleeve, so brief it might have been imagined, and then he was speaking, laying out in careful, unhurried terms the qualities of the new Oakhaven security paper, the kaolin clay slurry, the custom watermark, the resistance to acid tests that ordinary rag paper failed within seconds. He had barely finished when Stirling's voice cut across the hall, smooth and carrying. "Forgive me, nephew, but I confess I find it difficult to take seriously a duke who has traded his ducal crest for a mill apron. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Grease under the fingernails suits a tradesman well enough. It suits Oakhaven rather less. Thorn felt the old, familiar heat rise in his chest, the same helpless anger he'd carried since boyhood, watching his uncle dismantle his father piece by piece, with nothing but a well-timed sentence. He opened his mouth to answer. Kerensa stood first. She did it without hurry, without drama, simply rising from her chair as though she'd been waiting for precisely this cue and no other. From the leather case at her side, she produced 2 sheets of paper, laying them side by side on the long table where every man in the room could see. "Lord Stirling raises an interesting point about trade," she said, her voice carrying easily despite its quietness. "So let us discuss trade properly. This sheet," she tapped the first, "is genuine Bank of England paper, £5 sterling, issued 18 months ago. This sheet," she tapped the second, "was printed by a private house under license from Lord Stirling's own bank 3 months ago and passed as identical currency until a Bristol merchant grew suspicious of the ink." A murmur went through the hall. Stirling's smile had not moved, but something had gone rigid behind his eyes. "Forgeries happen to every bank, my dear," Stirling said smoothly. "It is hardly a mark against my house specifically." "No," Kerensa agreed. "It happens to every bank using ordinary paper, which is precisely my point." From her case, she drew a small glass vial and a fine brush. "May I demonstrate?" The chairman, visibly intrigued despite himself, gestured for her to proceed. She dipped the brush and drew a single line of iodine solution across the corner of Stirling's forged note. The paper darkened instantly, the fibers blotching in a way that made several of the assembled bankers lean forward. Then she drew the same line across a corner of a fresh sheet of Oakhaven paper, pulled from her case. Nothing happened. The paper remained exactly as it was, clean and pale. The watermark rose, still glowing faintly against the candlelight, when she held it up. "Ordinary rag paper reacts to iodine because of the starch used in its sizing," Kerensa explained, setting both sheets down for the room to examine. "Our paper uses no starch at all. The clay slurry replaces it entirely, and does so in a proportion no forger has yet managed to reproduce, because they do not know it, and I do not intend to tell them. A counterfeiter can copy an engraving. He cannot copy a chemical process he has never seen, and cannot test for without destroying his own forgery in the attempt." The hall had gone properly quiet now. Even the chairman had leaned forward to look at the 2 sheets side by side. Stirling recovered his composure quickly, but not quickly enough. "A clever parlor trick," he said, "proves little about. It proves your bank issued forged notes for 3 months without noticing," Kerensa said pleasantly, cutting him off with an ease that made Thorn want, absurdly, to laugh aloud in the middle of the guild hall.
"I imagine the Bank of England's inspectors will find that rather more than a parlor trick, Lord Stirling, when I bring both sheets to their attention next week." Nobody at the table spoke for a long moment.
Then a stout, grey-whiskered man near the far end, a Mr. Alasdair Blackwood, representing a private Scottish banking house, as Thorn would soon learn, cleared his throat and asked, quite simply, how many reams of the Oakhaven paper might be available for order by summer. Stirling's cane tapped once, sharply, against the floor, and he said nothing further for the remainder of the meeting. Outside, in the carriage, Thorn finally let himself laugh, low and disbelieving. "You had that letter of complaint ready for a week." "2 weeks," Kerensa said, folding her hands in her lap with the calm of a woman who had simply done her morning's work. I wanted to be certain the Bristol merchant's account matched the note precisely before I used it against him. Remind me, Thorn said, still shaking his head, never to make an enemy of you. Kerensa glanced at him sideways, something almost fond, flickering across her usually careful expression. Too late, Your Grace. You married one. London, summer 1843. Almax had never wanted her, and Kerensa had known it the moment she stepped through the doors. It was in the way conversations quieted a half-second too long as she passed, the way fans lifted to cover murmured words that weren't nearly as private as their owners believed. She had grown used to this in the months since the wedding, the particular cruelty of a room full of people too well-bred to say anything to her face, and too eager not to say it just behind her back. She had told herself, dressing that evening in pale blue silk that had cost more than her father had ever earned honestly in a year, that she did not care. She had built a mill. She had bested sterling in front of the entire guild hall. A room full of idle aristocrats making sport of her name was hardly a battlefield worth losing sleep over. She had not, however, accounted for Lady Sibylla Montfort. The trouble began quietly enough, near the refreshment table, where Lady Sibylla, golden-haired, exquisitely dressed, and possessed of the particular confidence of a woman who had never once been told no, had gathered a small cluster of the patronesses around her, like an audience arranging itself before a play. "I do wonder," Sibylla said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "how the Duke sleeps at night, knowing his wife's own father sits in a penal colony for forgery. One does hope the habit isn't hereditary." The laughter that followed was soft, careful, the kind designed to be deniable if challenged. Kerensa felt her spine go rigid, her hand tightening around her fan hard enough that the ivory ribs bit into her palm. She thought of 100 answers. She discarded every one of them. A defense would only confirm there was something to defend against, and Sibylla knew it, which was precisely why she'd chosen this ground and this audience to make her attack. "Forgive me," Kerensa said instead, keeping her voice perfectly even. "I hadn't realized penmanship was inherited like a title. Lady Sibylla, I shall have to mention that to the Royal Society. They'll be very interested." It was a small victory, and a fragile one. Sibylla's smile only sharpened. "How droll! Though I suppose a girl raised among criminals must learn to talk her way out of difficult rooms rather early." The patroness's fans stilled. Several pairs of eyes slid toward Kerensa, waiting, hungry for whatever came next. It was then that Thorn crossed the ballroom. He had been speaking with a group of gentlemen near the card room, close enough to have heard every word, and Kerensa watched him approach with something close to dread, certain he meant to diffuse the situation with careful diplomacy, some polite nothing that would smooth things over without truly answering the insult at all. She had grown used to a certain distance from him in public, cordial, correct, nothing that could be mistaken for affection. It was, she'd told herself, entirely sensible, safer for them both. Thorn did not stop at diplomacy. He walked directly to her, took her hand in front of the entire assembled room, and turned to face Lady Sibylla with an expression Kerensa had only seen once before, across a Guildhall table, facing his uncle. "Lady Sibylla," he said, his voice carrying easily across the sudden hush that had fallen over the ballroom, "I find myself curious. Do you know how close the Duchy of Oakhaven came to ruin 2 years ago?" Sibylla's confident smile flickered. I'm certain I couldn't say, Your Grace." "Close enough that my own uncle had already begun drafting the papers to claim it," Thorn continued. And now heads were turning throughout the room, conversations dying as the story reached further ears. close enough that I stood in my own library the night of my wedding, prepared to lose everything my family had held for 200 years. My wife spent that evening, instead of weeping over the match she'd been given, proving my uncle's fraud against me, and designing the paperworks that have since secured contracts with 3 private banking houses and the beginnings of a treaty with foreign treasuries. He turned, deliberately, to address the wider room now, his grip on Kerensa's hand firm and unhurried. The Duchess of Oakhaven did not marry into this family for status, Lady Sibylla, as I understand you did. She married into a ruin and built an empire from it. I would suggest that any woman in this room who has managed a comparable feat is welcome to laugh at her. The rest of you might consider curtsaying. Nobody laughed. The silence that followed was of an entirely different character than the one Sibylla had orchestrated. Heavier, more uncertain, the sound of a room recalculating its opinions in real time. Somewhere near the doorway, one of the older patronesses, a formidable woman Kerensa recognized as Mrs. Drummond Burrell, murmured something to her companion that ended, unmistakably, with the words, "Rather remarkable, actually." Lady Sibylla's composure did not shatter, quite. But her smile had gone thin and brittle, and she excused herself from the gathering with rather more haste than grace, disappearing toward the card room without a backward glance. Thorn did not release Kerensa's hand. "You didn't need to do that," she said quietly, once the orchestra had resumed and the room's attention had begun, gradually, to disperse elsewhere. "I know," Thorn said. "I wanted to." Kerensa looked up at him, searching his face for the careful diplomat she'd grown accustomed to these past months, and found instead something rawer, something that had clearly been waiting a long while for permission to surface. "That's twice now," she said slowly, "that you've defended me rather more fiercely than duty required." "Perhaps," Thorn said, and for the first time since their wedding night, something that might almost have been warmth crept into his voice. "Duty stopped being the whole of it some time ago, and I only just noticed." Bristol Docks, autumn 1843. The warehouse smelled of tar, salt, and damp timber, and Kerensa had spent 3 days inside it, counting crates, until she knew the number by heart. 240 reams of Oakhaven security paper, bound for the Bank of Scotland, aboard the merchant brig Osprey, due to sail on the evening tide. It was, by any measure, the largest single order the mill had yet filled. It was also, as she'd told Thorn more than once over the past week, precisely the sort of prize that would tempt a desperate man to something reckless. "Sterling's finished in London," she said, watching through the warehouse's narrow window as dock hands loaded the last crates from a neighboring vessel under lantern light. "The Guildhall humiliated him. Almack's finished the job. He has nothing left to lose by being ugly about it." Thorn, checking the ledger of loaded crates against the manifest for the 3rd time that evening, didn't look up. "You think he'd risk violence?" "I think a man who forged banknotes to ruin his own nephew's father won't hesitate over a warehouse fire." She had not meant it as prophecy. But that was precisely the message that reached her 2 nights later, carried by a thin, nervous boy around 19 years who arrived at their rented lodgings near midnight, soaked through from the rain and clutching a scrap of paper with a name scrawled on it that Kerensa recognized instantly, an old associate of her father's, a print shop hand named Fenwick, who'd once helped forge documents for men far worse than Sterling, before finding honest work along the Bristol waterfront. "He says to come quick, ma'am," the boy stammered, water dripping from his cap onto the good carpet. "Says there's men paid to burn the Oakhaven warehouse tonight, and the tide don't wait." Thorn was already reaching for his coat before the boy finished speaking. "How many men?" Kerensa said, pulling her cloak from its hook with hands that had gone perfectly steady, the way they always did when there was work to be done rather than time to be frightened. "4, maybe 5, ma'am. Dock toughs, paid in coin, not questions." They rode for the docks with 6 of the estate's guardsmen roused from their beds, armed with whatever had come to hand: pistols, a pair of old cavalry sabers Thorn's father had kept mounted above the library fire, a stout length of iron bar that one of the men had simply grabbed from the stable wall on his way out. The warehouse district at midnight was a maze of black water and blacker shadow, lit only by scattered dock lanterns and the distant glow of ships riding at anchor. Kerensa smelled the smoke before she saw the flame. A thin, acrid thread on the wind, coming from the alley behind their warehouse, where barrels of pitch were stored for caulking hulls. "There," Thorn said, and spurred his horse forward. They found 3 men crouched near the warehouse's rear door, one of them already striking flint against a pile of oiled rags stacked deliberately against the timber wall. The man barely had time to look up before Thorn was off his horse and into him, the 2 of them crashing into a stack of empty crates that scattered across the cobbles with a sound like gunfire. The fight that followed was ugly, fast, and entirely unlike anything in the novels Kerensa had occasionally allowed herself to read as a girl. There was no elegance to it, only grunting, cursing men grappling in near darkness, the guardsmen wading in with fists and iron, one of Sterling's hired thugs going down hard beneath a saber's flat side, another fleeing into the alley's black mouth rather than face 6 armed men for a coin purse that suddenly seemed insufficient compensation. Kerensa did not stay to watch. While Thorn held the warehouse door, she was already inside, directing 4 of the dock's night watchmen, bribed handsomely, weeks earlier, precisely against a night like this one, to help haul the crates toward the loading ramp. "The Osprey sails within the hour," she called over the chaos outside. "And every crate goes aboard before it does, fire or no fire." They worked in a frantic chain. Crate after crate passed hand to hand, down the ramp and into the ship's hold, while behind them the pile of oiled rags finally caught properly, flame licking up the warehouse's rear wall despite Thorn's best efforts to kick it apart before it spread. Smoke thickened in the rafters. Somewhere above, a support beam groaned. "Kerensa!" Thorn's voice cracked through the noise, edged with something she'd never heard from him before. Not command, but naked fear. "Leave the last of them. It isn't worth." 6 more crates, she shouted back, already lifting one herself, her fine gloves forgotten, her arms burning with the strain. 6 more, and the contract is saved. She would remember, afterward, that it was the least dignified moment of her life. Stumbling down a smoke-choked ramp in a ruined gown, coughing, half-blind, a duke's wife hauling cargo like a common dock worker, and that she had never in her life felt more certain she was doing exactly what she was meant to do. The last crate went aboard as the warehouse's roof caved inward behind them with a roar of collapsing timber and a fountain of sparks that lit the whole dock red. The Osprey's captain, roused from his cabin by the commotion, took one look at the burning warehouse, the exhausted guardsman, and the singed but triumphant Duchess standing on his deck, and simply gave the order to cast off early. They watched from the quayside as the ship slipped out into the dark water, its cargo safe, the warehouse behind them, a smoldering ruin lit against the night sky. Thorn's hand found hers in the dark, his knuckles bloodied, his coat torn at the shoulder. "You could have been finished tonight." "So could you," Kerensa said, still breathing hard, watching the Osprey's lanterns dwindle toward the harbor mouth. "I find I mind that rather more than I expected to, Your Grace." Thorn looked down at her for a long moment, smoke-stained and disheveled and entirely unlike any duchess London had ever produced, and something in his face settled, quietly, into certainty. "Then let us not make a habit of nearly dying," he said. "I find I've grown rather attached to the alternative." Oakhaven Priory, winter 1844. The snow came early that year, and by the second week of December, it had sealed the estate off from London as thoroughly as a castle under siege. The mail coach couldn't reach the Priory's gates. The mill stood silent, its water wheel locked fast in ice. The workers sent home to wait out the storm, with their wages paid in advance. For the first time in over a year, there was nothing urgent for either of them to do. It was this stillness, Kerensa would later think, that finally broke something loose in Thorn. She found him in his father's study on a gray afternoon. The fire burned low, snow ticking against the window panes like something trying to get in. He was sitting at the old desk, not his own desk in the library, but his father's, in the small, seldom-used room at the top of the west stair that had stood largely untouched since the old Duke's death. A false panel behind one of the drawers stood open, and papers were scattered across the desk's surface in a way that told her he had been sitting there for some time. Thorn. He didn't look up. His face, in the weak firelight, had gone the color of old ash. "I found these an hour ago," he said, his voice strangely flat. "I'd forgotten this desk had a false back. My father showed it to me once, when I was a boy, as though it were a game." He pushed a bundle of letters across the desk toward her, without further explanation. Kerensa sat and read. They were financial reports, dozens of them, spanning nearly 3 years before the old Duke's death. Reports of failed investments, collapsed mines, ruinous debts, all bearing Sterling's careful hand and Sterling's careful seal. And beneath them, correspondence, letters from the old Duke to his brother, increasingly frantic, increasingly desperate, begging for explanation, for mercy, for time. Letters that Sterling had answered, each time, with fresh figures showing the situation worsening, the debts compounding, the family's ruin drawing ever closer. "These figures are false," Kerensa said quietly, after nearly 20 minutes of careful reading, cross-checking dates against the ledgers she already knew by heart. "Half these mining ventures never existed at all. He invented losses that never happened, Thorn. He built an entire fictional catastrophe and fed it to your father, one letter at a time. He didn't buy up my father's debts because my father was careless," Thorn said, his voice very quiet now, very controlled, in the way of a man holding something back by main force. "He created the debts. He drove my father into the grave with lies, so that he could claim the ruin as his own doing and step into the wreckage as the only man capable of saving what remained." He laughed, short and humorless. "He didn't want the estate, Kerensa. He wanted to watch my father break under the weight of a fortune that was never truly lost." Kerensa set the letters down carefully, as though they might shatter, and moved around the desk to where Thorn sat, with his head bowed, his hands pressed flat against the wood, as if to steady something that had come loose inside him. "He was your father," she said softly. "You're allowed to grieve him twice." Something in Thorn's composure finally gave way. He did not weep loudly, or dramatically. It was quieter than that. A slow unraveling of a man who had spent 2 years believing his father's death was simple misfortune, only to learn it had been crime committed with paper and patience instead of a blade. Kerensa knelt beside his chair and said nothing further, only rested her hand over his on the desk, and let the fire's low crackle fill the silence where words would only have gotten in the way. "I never told you," Thorn said finally, "how it felt, watching him fade. He stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping. He'd sit up nights with his ledgers, convinced he'd missed some error that would explain how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. I told myself he simply hadn't the head for business that I had. I judged him for it, Kerensa. I judged my own father for dying of grief my uncle manufactured. You didn't know. I should have questioned it. I should have looked harder." He turned his hand over beneath hers, gripping her fingers with sudden, fierce need. "You looked harder. 5 hours into our marriage, you looked harder than I managed in 2 years of grieving him. I had less to lose by being suspicious," Kerensa said gently. "You had a father to trust." They sat like that for a long while, the storm pressing against the windows, the fire burning down to embers neither of them moved to tend. Something had shifted in the room, in the year between them, in the careful distance they had both maintained since their wedding night, out of caution, out of fear of a marriage built on debt and desperation rather than choice. When Thorn finally raised his head and looked at her, there was nothing careful left in his expression at all. "Kerensa," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded different than it ever had before. Not the polite address of a duke to his duchess, but something rawer, something that had been waiting a long while to be spoken plainly. "I did not choose you, in the beginning. My uncle chose you for me, meaning it as an insult, meaning to hand me a wife nobody would respect, so that I would have nothing left to defend. I have never once thanked him for anything in my life, and I never will. But I find, this evening, that I cannot regret the outcome, whatever his intentions." Kerensa's breath caught. Outside, the snow fell thicker, sealing the priory further still from the world beyond its walls, as though the house itself had decided to grant them privacy. "Thorn, I am not asking for gratitude," he said, "or duty, or partnership, though I am grateful for all three. I am asking whether there is room, after everything, for something considerably less practical than a business alliance." She answered him not with words, but by closing the distance between them entirely. And this time, when his hand rose to her face and hers to the collar of his coat, there was no ledger between them, no mill, no contract requiring either of their signatures. Only two people who had spent a year building an empire together, finally allowing themselves to build something smaller and infinitely more difficult, a marriage neither of them had asked for, and both of them, at last, wanted. The fire burned to nothing before either of them thought to notice, and outside, the snow buried the priory in white silence until morning. Edinburgh, spring 1844. The letter arrived in March, sealed with the crest of the Austro-Hungarian legation in London, and Kerensa read it twice before allowing herself to believe it. "They want to meet us in Edinburgh," she told Thorn, setting the letter down across the breakfast table with hands that were not quite steady. Both the Austro-Hungarian Treasury envoy and a Prussian representative, together, in the same fortnight. "If we can secure even one contract, it opens every treasury in Europe to Oakhaven paper." Thorn set down his coffee. "And if we secure both? Then Sterling's remaining influence in London becomes entirely irrelevant because we will no longer need London at all." They traveled north within the week, the roads still muddy with the last of the winter thaw, and took rooms in a grand hotel overlooking Princes Street, where the castle sat black and ancient against a sky the color of pewter. Kerensa had never seen Edinburgh before and found herself, in quieter moments, wishing there were time to simply look at it properly. The steep closes, the smoke rising from 1,000 chimneys, the strange, thrilling sense of a city built on rock and stubbornness both. But there was no time for looking. There was only the meeting, 3 days hence, upon which the whole of their foreign ambitions rested. The Prussian envoy, a courteous, careful man named Herr von Reck, proved easy enough to charm with facts and figures alone. It was the Austro-Hungarian representative, a sharp-eyed count with a gift for saying very little, who gave Kerensa the greater difficulty, until, on the second evening, Lady Sibylla Montfort walked into their hotel's private dining room entirely uninvited, and Kerensa understood at once that the difficulty had just multiplied considerably. "Your Grace, Duchess." Sibylla's smile was bright, brittle, entirely too pleased with itself. "What a delightful coincidence, finding you both so far from London." "Lady Sibylla," Thorn said, his voice gone cold in the particular way it always did around her. "I don't recall extending an invitation." "No," Sibylla agreed, settling herself into a chair as though she had been asked to. "I extended my own. I find Edinburgh society rather charming this time of year, and I understand Herr von Reck is dining here this very evening." Kerensa felt the trap close before Sibylla had even finished speaking. Sibylla had not traveled 400 miles for the scenery. She had come to interfere, and Kerensa had a fairly precise idea of how. She was not wrong. Within the hour, seated at a discreet distance during the pre-dinner reception, Kerensa watched Sibylla draw the Prussian envoy aside with practiced ease, watched the woman's gloved hand rest briefly on his sleeve, watched a small folded note pass between them with the casual grace of a woman who had clearly done this sort of thing before. "She's offering him money," Kerensa murmured to Thorn, watching from across the room. "Or something he wants more than money, to withdraw from our contract. Can you prove it?" "I don't need to prove it. I need to make it not matter." She was already moving, crossing the room with the same unhurried composure she'd once used to face down an entire hall of hostile bankers, and arrived at Sibylla's shoulder just as von Reck was folding the note into his coat pocket with a faintly troubled expression. "Lady Sibylla," Kerensa said pleasantly, "how is your father's estate managing these days? I understand the Montfort lands in Hampshire had rather a difficult harvest last autumn." Sibylla's smile flickered, just barely. "I couldn't say I follow such matters closely." "No, I imagine you wouldn't, given how little there is left to follow." Kerensa kept her tone light, conversational, the way one might discuss the weather. "It's remarkable, really, how quickly an estate's fortunes can unravel when the mortgages come due faster than the rents come in. I understand your father has been quietly selling off the good silver these past 2 years to keep the appearance of solvency. Rather like painting a rotting fence, wouldn't you say? Looks well enough from the road." Von Reck, listening with the careful stillness of a diplomat filing away useful information, said nothing, but Kerensa saw the exact moment his expression shifted from politely curious to quietly calculating. Sibylla's composure cracked at last. "How dare you?" "I dare a great deal, Lady Sibylla. When someone attempts to sabotage a treaty I have spent 18 months building." Kerensa's voice never rose, never lost its pleasant, conversational tone, which somehow made the words land harder than shouting ever could. "I would think very carefully before offering any further gentleman notes tonight, unless you'd like the whole room discussing which Hampshire silversmiths have lately been buying rather a lot of old family plate." Sibylla left within the quarter hour, her composure in ruins, her carriage called for, with a haste that drew several curious glances from the other guests. Herr von Reck, for his part, approached Kerensa directly before dinner was even served, drawing the folded note from his pocket and setting it, unopened, on the table between them. "I confess, Duchess, I had not intended to accept," he said, with the faint, dry humor of a man who had seen a great many attempts at bribery in his career and recognized a clumsy one when it arrived. "But I find myself considerably more inclined to sign your contract, having watched you dismantle Lady Montfort so thoroughly without raising your voice once. A woman who negotiates that well over dinner negotiates well over paper." The contract was signed 3 days later, not merely with the Prussian treasury, but with the Austro-Hungarian legation as well, securing Oakhaven paper, an exclusive 5-year supply agreement across both empires, a coup that would, within the month, be discussed in whispers throughout every counting house in London. Thorne found her that night on the hotel balcony, looking out over the castle's black silhouette against the stars, and slipped his arms around her from behind without a word. "Sterling will hear of this within the week," he said quietly against her hair. "Let him," Kerensa said, leaning back against him, watching the last lights of Prince's Street flicker in the dark below. "Let him hear that his niece by marriage's forger father taught her rather more than penmanship. Let him understand, finally, exactly what he handed me the night he thought he was ruining you. The Thames Embankment, autumn 1844. The knock came at dawn, hard and official, and Kerensa knew before she'd even reached the door that something had gone badly wrong. 6 Bow Street officers stood on the Priory's front steps, flanked by a magistrate's clerk clutching a warrant, and behind them, unmistakably, Lord Sterling's carriage waited at the end of the drive, with its curtains drawn just enough to suggest he was watching without wishing to be seen doing so. "Kerensa Ashworth," the lead officer said, reading from the warrant with the flat, practiced tone of a man who had delivered a great many unwelcome announcements in his career. "You are charged with high treason against the Crown for the manufacture and circulation of forged Bank of England currency." Thorne, arriving at the doorway behind her still in his dressing gown, went utterly still. "You will explain that charge, sir, or you will remove yourself from my property. A vault search was conducted at first light, Your Grace, following information laid before the magistrate." The officer's expression flickered, just slightly, with something almost like discomfort. Forged notes were discovered, concealed within the estate's counting-house vault, printed, we believe, upon paper matching your own mill's production. Kerensa's stomach dropped. She understood, in that single frozen instant, precisely what had happened and precisely who had arranged it. Sterling had not attacked the business this time. He had attacked her directly, planting the one piece of evidence capable of ending everything, her freedom, the mill, the Oakhaven name itself, in a single stroke. They took her to a holding room at the magistrate's court, rather than a common gaol, a small mercy owed to her rank, though it felt like precious little comfort as the door locked behind her and she was left alone with a single barred window and several hours to consider the gallows that awaited a conviction of treason. She did not weep, she thought. By the time Thorne was permitted to see her that afternoon, accompanied by a barrister he'd summoned at considerable expense and greater speed, Kerensa had already worked through the problem 3 times over in her mind, the way she worked through any faulty ledger, methodically from the beginning, discarding nothing until the discrepancy revealed itself. "Bring me the forged notes," she said, before Thorne had even finished crossing the room. "All of them, and a microscope, if the magistrate's office has one, or send to the Royal Society if it hasn't." "Kerensa, you're facing a treason charge, not a—" "I'm facing a fraud dressed up as treason, and the two are not answered the same way." She gripped his hands across the small table, her voice low and urgent. Sterling didn't have time to properly replicate our formula. He's had, at most, 4 months since our Edinburgh triumph to arrange this. That isn't enough time to reverse engineer a clay slurry it took my father a lifetime to perfect. If these notes were printed on genuine Oakhaven paper, it's because he stole finished sheets from us directly, not because he's learned to copy them. And if he printed forged notes on stolen paper using an engraver of his own hire, that engraver used ink, Thorn, and ink can be traced. It took 2 days to arrange, and every hour of it felt like a year. But eventually, under the careful supervision of the magistrate's own clerk and a chemist summoned from the Royal Society to observe and confirm her findings, Kerensa was permitted to examine the forged notes under lamp and lens. She found what she was looking for within the first hour. "Iron gall ink," she said, holding the note up to the light for the assembled witnesses to see. But not the traditional formulation. This has been mixed with a synthetic compound, Prussian blue derivative, unless I am very much mistaken, used to deepen the black more cheaply than proper oak gall tannin allows. My mill has never stocked synthetic compounds of any kind. Every drop of ink used on genuine Oakhaven printed material comes from a single supplier in Bristol, whose ledgers I would be glad to have examined against these notes' chemical signature. The chemist confirmed her analysis within the hour. The ink was, beyond reasonable dispute, not of Oakhaven's manufacture. It was progress, but not proof of innocence. Only proof that someone else had done the printing, which still left the paper itself, stolen or otherwise, unaccounted for. Thorn, refusing to wait on further courtroom procedure, took matters into his own hands that same night, riding down to the riverside tenements along the Thames, where London's less reputable engravers were known to keep their workshops, armed with nothing but Kerensa's description of the ink and a purse heavy enough to loosen tongues. He found his man on the 3rd attempt, a nervous, ink-stained fellow named Crabbe, working out of a single dank room above a chandler's shop, who took one look at Thorn's face in the lamplight and understood immediately that lying was no longer a survivable option. "Lord Sterling paid me £40, Crabbe confessed, hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his own candle steady, to reproduce the plates from a genuine note, using paper his man delivered, already cut to size. I never asked where the paper came from, Your Grace. I swear it, I only did the engraving. He said if I spoke a word of it, he'd see me transported, same as—" He stopped himself, but Kerensa, when Thorn relayed the confession to her the following morning, finished the sentence in her own mind without difficulty. Same as her father. The confession, sworn before a magistrate and corroborated by the ink analysis, unraveled the entire scheme within a week. The charges against Kerensa were dismissed. A new warrant was drawn, this time bearing Sterling's own name, for conspiracy to commit fraud and the fabrication of evidence before a magistrate's court, a charge considerably more serious than anything he had attempted to pin on her. Sterling did not wait to be arrested. By the time the Bow Street officers reached his townhouse, he had already fled to the continent, leaving behind an empty study, a hastily abandoned breakfast, and a single unfinished letter on his desk, addressed to nobody, in which he had begun, and never completed, an explanation of everything he had done and why. Kerensa read it once, when Thorn brought it to her, and set it down without comment. "He'll come back," she said finally. "Men like him always believe they've one final move left to play." She was, as it turned out, entirely correct. Westminster, winter 1845, Sterling's final move, when it came, arrived not with violence, but with paper, which was, Kerensa reflected afterward, rather fitting for a man who had built his entire ruin on it. He returned to England in January, quietly, under cover of a pardon he had somehow negotiated through influential friends still willing to vouch for him despite everything. A pardon that covered the fraud charge but left the fabrication of evidence conveniently unresolved, tied up in procedural delay by lawyers Kerensa suspected he'd paid handsomely to keep it that way. And having returned, he did not slink quietly back to whatever remained of his fortune. He went, instead, directly to Westminster, where he still commanded enough goodwill among certain lords to have a bill drafted and brought before a special parliamentary commission on banking security and currency fraud. The bill, when Thorn finally obtained a copy of it, was elegant in its cruelty. It proposed, under the guise of protecting the Crown's currency from forgery, to ban all private manufacture of security-grade banknote paper, placing the trade exclusively under licenses granted by the Bank of England, licenses that Sterling, through 2 private banking connections he still controlled, stood conveniently positioned to profit from himself. "He's trying to legislate us out of existence," Thorn said, reading the bill a second time by lamplight, his jaw tight. "If this passes, the mill becomes worthless within a year. Every contract we hold, foreign and domestic, becomes void the moment our license is denied, and he will see to it personally that it is denied." "Then we don't let it pass," Kerensa said simply. The commission convened in the 3rd week of January, in a chamber of the House of Lords, grand enough to make even Thorn, born to such rooms, feel the full weight of what hung upon the coming hour. Kerensa was not permitted to speak before the assembled lords. A woman's testimony carried no formal standing in such proceedings, regardless of her role in the very business under discussion. But she was permitted the gallery, and it was from there, notes in hand, that she watched Thorn take his seat below, in full ducal regalia, robes and coronet both, dressed as deliberately as a man arming for battle. Sterling spoke first, and spoke well. Kerensa had to grant him that, watching him work the chamber with the same practiced charm that had once fooled an entire guild hall. He painted a picture of reckless private enterprise threatening the Crown's monetary integrity, of unregulated mills producing paper of unknown provenance, of the recent scandal at Oakhaven, carefully omitting his own role in fabricating it, as evidence of exactly the chaos his bill was designed to prevent. Thorn rose when Sterling finished, and Kerensa watched the chamber settle into the particular quiet reserved for men it did not yet know whether to respect or dismiss. "My lords," Thorn began, "my uncle has spoken eloquently of chaos and provenance. Allow me to speak instead of arithmetic, since arithmetic, unlike rhetoric, does not lie." He laid out, over the following half-hour, a case built as carefully as any ledger Kerensa had ever assembled, the audited balance sheets from 3 private banking houses now using Oakhaven paper, each confirming a measurable decline in forgery losses since adoption. Sworn testimony, read into record, from the Bristol merchant whose suspicion had first exposed Sterling's forged notes. The confession of the engraver Crabbe, still on file with the Bow Street magistrate, naming Sterling directly as the architect of the scheme meant to destroy his own nephew's wife. "My lords," Thorn said, his voice carrying clean and hard through the chamber, "my uncle asks you to place the entire trade of secure currency paper under licenses he himself stands to profit from, on the grounds that private manufacture cannot be trusted. I would ask this commission to consider which is the greater threat to the Crown's currency: a private mill whose paper has, in 18 months, defeated every forgery attempted against it, or a man who has already been shown before a magistrate's court to have fabricated treason charges against an innocent woman in order to seize control of that very mill for himself. From the gallery Kerensa produced, on cue, the forensic chemistry report she had prepared for exactly this moment, passing it down through a clerk stationed for the purpose to the commission's chairman. The ink analysis, the confession, the full chain of evidence laid out in her own precise hand, cross-referenced against the very balance sheets Thorne had just cited. The chamber, by the time the reading concluded, had gone entirely silent. Sterling attempted, once more, to speak in his own defense, his voice noticeably less steady than it had been an hour before. "My lords, I would remind the commission that no formal conviction has yet been—" "No formal conviction," interrupted an elderly lord near the chamber's center, whom Kerensa would later learn was widely respected for a lifetime spent on banking regulation. "Because you fled the country before one could be secured, Lord Sterling, and returned only once a pardon had quietly excused the lesser charge. I confess I find myself considerably less inclined, hearing this evidence, to place the entire private paper trade under licenses controlled by a man who has demonstrated, rather conclusively, precisely what he is willing to do to eliminate a competitor." The vote, when it came 3 days later, was not close. The bill was rejected by a margin wide enough to end any possibility of Sterling reviving it under a different name, and a formal request was entered before the Commission's own authority to reopen the fabrication charges against him, this time with no procedural delay available to soften the blow. Sterling did not remain in London to face it, but this time, when he fled, he did so with considerably less money, considerably less influence, and considerably fewer friends willing to shelter him than he had possessed even a month before. "One more move," Kerensa said quietly to Thorne, as they left the chamber together into the cold Westminster evening, "and I don't believe he has another one left to play." She was not entirely correct, but the move that remained to him, as it turned out, would not be one of cunning. It would be one of desperation, and desperation, Kerensa had learned, was always the easiest kind of enemy to defeat. The City of London, spring 1845. The rumor began, as most ruinous rumors do, with a grain of truth left to fester until it grew monstrous. It started in a coffee house near Lombard Street, where a clerk from Sterling's own bank, unpaid for 2 months and increasingly convinced his employer's fortune had collapsed entirely, let slip to a companion that Lord Sterling had been quietly selling off sound investments to cover debts nobody could quite account for. By the following morning, the rumor had grown teeth. By the afternoon, it had grown legs, and by evening, it was running through every counting house in the city, with the particular speed reserved for stories people wanted to believe. Kerensa heard the full account from Mr. Blackwood, the Scottish banker who had been among the first to sign with Oakhaven paper back at the Guildhall, who arrived at their London townhouse unannounced and considerably out of breath. "Sterling's depositors are withdrawing," he said, without preamble. "Word of the Parliamentary Commission reached the wrong ears, and now half the city believes his bank is as fraudulent as the man himself. There's a crowd gathering outside his doors on Lombard Street, even as I speak, Your Grace, demanding their gold." Thorne exchanged a glance with Kerensa across the room, and she saw in his face the same thought already forming in her own mind. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough that he won't survive the week without new capital, and no respectable house will lend to him now. Not after the commission. He's finished, Duchess, in every sense that matters." Blackwood hesitated. "I only thought you'd wish to know, given everything." They rode to Lombard Street within the hour and found the scene precisely as described. A crowd of perhaps 200 anxious depositors packed against Sterling's bank doors, shopkeepers and merchants and minor gentry alike, all clutching passbooks and demanding, with the particular desperate fury of people who suspected they had already lost everything, that their gold be produced immediately. Constables stood at the bank's entrance, more to prevent the doors being broken down than to maintain any real order, and through the crowd's shifting mass, Kerensa caught glimpses of Sterling himself through the bank's front window, pale and diminished, arguing with two clerks over ledgers that no longer added up to anything worth defending. "There's a man finished," Thorne murmured, watching. 18 months ago, I'd have felt nothing but satisfaction at this sight. And now, he considered the question seriously before answering. Now I find I've rather more urgent business than savoring it. They gained entry through a side door, past a clerk who recognized the Duke and Duchess of Oakhaven, and, sensing correctly that they represented the last reasonable prospect his employer had left, ushered them directly into the boardroom where Sterling sat alone, his silver-topped cane resting untouched beside him, looking, for the first time in Kerensa's acquaintance with him, entirely without artifice. "Come to watch, have you?" Sterling said, not looking up. "I'd have thought you'd send a footman to enjoy it on your behalf." "We've come to make an offer," Kerensa said. That got his attention. He looked up sharply, suspicion warring with something that might, in a more honest man, have been hope. "An offer?" "Your entire portfolio," Thorne said, sitting across from him without waiting to be invited. "Every land mortgage, every debt bond, every outstanding loan currently held by this house. We'll purchase the lot, in full, today, before that crowd outside decides patience is no longer a virtue worth practicing." Sterling's laugh was short and bitter. "At what price, nephew?" "I imagine you mean to strip me to the bone and call it charity." "Pennies on the pound," Kerensa said flatly, "because that is precisely what your portfolio is worth to any buyer today, Lord Sterling, and precisely what it will be worth tomorrow if you attempt to negotiate a better price with a mob outside your door and no capital behind you to meet a single further withdrawal. We are not the only interested party who will hear of this by evening. We are simply the only one offering before your ruin becomes total rather than merely severe." For a long moment, Sterling said nothing, his fingers tracing the silver head of his cane in small, unconscious circles. Kerensa watched something move behind his eyes, not quite grief, not quite fury, but the particular helpless calculation of a man realizing, all at once and far too late, that every clever move he had ever made had led inexorably to this single room, this single humiliating choice, offered to him by the two people he had spent 3 years trying to destroy. "You understand," he said finally, "that accepting this leaves me with nothing. No estate, no bank, no name worth carrying in any room that matters." "You should have considered that," Thorne said, "the night you falsified the papers that finished my father, or the morning you had my wife arrested for treason on evidence you manufactured yourself. I owe you no mercy, uncle. I am offering you a price, not a pardon." Sterling signed within the hour, the papers transferring his entire portfolio into Oakhaven's hands were drawn up and witnessed before the crowd outside had even begun to disperse, and by the time the last anxious depositor had been paid out, using funds Thorne and Kerensa provided directly, in exchange for the debts now legally theirs, Lord Sterling's private banking house existed in name only, a shell with nothing left inside it, and its former master a man with barely enough remaining to book passage back to whatever corner of the continent might still tolerate him. He left London that same week, without ceremony, without farewell, and without, so far as either of them ever learned, a single friend willing to see him off at the docks. Kerensa watched their carriage pull away from Lombard Street that evening. The crowd finally dispersed, the bank's darkened windows reflecting the last of the sunset like something already forgotten. "It doesn't feel the way I thought it would," she admitted quietly. "No," Thorn agreed, taking her hand. "Victory rarely does, once you're finally standing inside it. But I find I don't need it to feel triumphant, Kerensa. I only need it to be finished." And at last, after 3 years of ledgers and fire and forged paper and 100 small battles fought in ballrooms and boardrooms and courtrooms alike, it finally was. Oakhaven Estate, summer 1846. 18 months had reshaped the valley beyond anything Thorn's grandfather would have recognized. Where a single rusted grain mill had once creaked over a half-frozen stream, 3 new water wheels now turned steadily along the widened mill race, feeding a works that employed close to 200 souls, drawn from every village within 10 miles. The old tenant cottages, which had stood half-ruined and leaking for a generation, had been rebuilt in good stone with proper chimneys and glass windows that actually kept out the weather. A small schoolhouse stood at the valley's eastern edge, built at Kerensa's insistence, where the mill workers' families, and, increasingly, families from further afield who had heard there was steady, honest work and fair wages to be found at Oakhaven, sent their sons and daughters to learn letters and figures both. Kerensa stood on the high terrace above the priory that July morning, looking down over all of it, and found she still could not quite believe the valley had once been the ruin she'd inherited on her wedding night. "You're doing the thing again," Thorn said, coming to stand beside her, "where you look at all of it as though you expect it to vanish if you blink. 3 years ago, this was frozen mud, and a mill nobody had touched in a decade," she said. "I think I'm allowed a little disbelief." He laughed, low and warm, an easy sound that had become as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. Nothing at all like the careful, guarded man who had stood in his library that first cold night, bracing himself for a weeping bride he never received. He'd changed, as thoroughly as the valley had, steadier now, surer, a man who had learned that strength did not require standing alone. "I have something for you," he said, and produced from inside his coat a rolled document, sealed with wax and ribbon in a manner considerably grander than any mortgage deed or business contract Kerensa had handled in 3 years of handling exactly that sort of paper. She unrolled it carefully and felt her breath catch. It was a royal charter, granted under seal, formally recognizing what the newspapers had already begun calling, somewhat grandly, an empire in miniature. The mills, the contracts spanning half of Europe's treasuries, the trade that had transformed a debt-ridden ducal estate into one of the most respected private financial enterprises in the kingdom. But it was the name inscribed at the charter's head that made her hands go still. The National Security Press of Britain. "You didn't tell me you'd applied for this." "I wanted it to be a surprise." Thorn's expression had gone unusually solemn for a man delivering good news. "I petitioned the Crown 6 months ago, Kerensa, on one condition attached to the request, which I insisted upon rather more firmly than the officials handling it were entirely comfortable with." "What condition?" "That the charter name both of us, not merely the Duke of Oakhaven, as founder and proprietor, with his wife listed somewhere beneath as an afterthought." He nodded toward the document in her hands. "Read the second line." She did, and found her own name there, printed with the same formal weight as his own. Kerensa Ashworth, Duchess of Oakhaven, co-founder and principal architect. Not a footnote, not a courtesy, a partnership, recognized by the crown itself, in ink that would outlast them both. I told the officials, Thorne continued, that this enterprise would not exist at all were it not for the mind that built it from a stack of 40-year-old ledgers on a wedding night neither of us wanted. I informed them, rather plainly, that I would decline the charter entirely if it did not reflect that truth. They found this position eccentric. I found it non-negotiable. Kerensa realized, holding the charter with hands that had gone unexpectedly unsteady, that she was closer to weeping than she had been in the entire 3 years of fire and forgery and courtroom battles that had brought them here. Closer than she'd been the night Sterling's warehouse burned, closer than she'd been standing in a Bow Street holding cell facing the gallows. It struck her, standing on the terrace with the wind moving warm across the valley below, that she had spent so long proving her worth through ledgers and chemistry and courtroom evidence that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to simply be given something, freely, by a man who wanted nothing further in return than to see her stand beside him rather than behind him. "You once told me," she said, when she trusted her voice again, "that you weren't asking for gratitude, or duty, or partnership. I remember. I find myself wanting to give you all three anyway." He drew her close, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything further, content simply to stand together on the terrace and look out over everything they had built. The wheels turning steadily in the valley below, the smoke rising thin and honest from the mill chimneys, reciting sums and letters in a village that had once had nothing to offer its young, beyond hard labor and early graves. "My uncle meant this marriage as a punishment," Thorne said finally. "A wife he believed would ruin me faster and more thoroughly than his falsified debts alone ever could. I wonder, sometimes, whether he ever imagines what became of his little cruelty." "I imagine he does," Kerensa said, rather bitterly, "wherever he's washed up on the continent. Do you regret any of it? The forgery charges, the fire, the fear of the gallows?" Kerensa considered the question honestly, turning it over the way she turned over any figure that mattered, before answering. "I regret that it cost what it cost. I don't regret where it led." She looked up at him, and for the first time in the whole long chronicle of ledgers and fire and forged paper that had brought them to this terrace, allowed herself simply to smile, without calculation, without strategy, without anything at all beneath it but plain and uncomplicated happiness. "They gave you a bride to destroy the estate, Your Grace. I rather think we ought to send them a proper thank you, wherever they've scattered to. We built considerably better than they ever intended to ruin." Below them, the water wheels turned on, steady and unhurried, carrying the valley's future forward one careful revolution at a time. An empire built not on inheritance or title, but on two people who had once been strangers across a mahogany desk and had since become, in every way that mattered, equals.